We're going to look at how muscles make ATP in this video. So we need ATP for two things during muscle contraction. So one is we need it to pull the myosin head back so it can do the power stroke. So remember, that's kind of like pulling the slingshot back. And then we also need ATP to bind to the myosin head so that when it's attached to the actin or the thin filament, it can actually let go of the thin filament and then go ahead and then get ready to do another power stroke. So if there's no ATP, the myosin head can't detach from the actin and it just stays stuck there. There's a little bit of ATP in the muscle cells, but it runs out very quickly. So the cell doesn't store a lot of ATP inside of it. There are three sources of ATP that the muscle cell will utilize. So this would be really important to know for the exam. The first source of ATP for all muscle contractions is going to come from something called creatine phosphate. Okay, so that would be important to know. And then if we have light to moderate exercise and we can get enough blood and oxygen to the muscles, we can use the mitochondria and do aerobic respiration. And then if we're doing intense exercise like weightlifting or sprinting and we can't get enough blood and oxygen to the muscles, we can't use the mitochondria, then we have to do fermentation. Here's a nice picture that summarizes the three ways to make ATP in skeletal muscle cells. The first way that you're going to make ATP when you start contracting your muscle, and it doesn't matter if you're doing light, moderate, or heavy exercise, is you're going to use this creatine phosphate. And I just kind of wrote it bigger here, but it's down at the bottom in this picture. And the molecule creatine phosphate has a phosphate group on it, and an enzyme is going to come along and take the phosphate group off the creatine phosphate and stick it onto ADP to make ATP. So this will supply ATP for about the first 15 seconds of contraction. And then you'll run out of the creatine phosphate, and then you're going to have to switch over and start using either aerobic respiration or fermentation. And before we get to the other two, the interesting thing about creatine phosphate is that when the creatine phosphate gets worn out, it does get released from your muscle cells, and it gets released at a pretty constant rate, and you'll replace it. But the creatine actually gets converted into creatinine, and the creatinine will then be excreted from the blood by the kidneys into the urine as a waste product. And you can actually measure the creatinine in the blood, and it will tell you how well it'll kind of give you an idea of how well the kidneys are functioning by how much creatinine is in the blood, because if the kidneys aren't functioning very well, they're not filtering out the creatinine very well. And so you'll get high levels of creatinine in the blood with kidney failure. Okay, so let's take a look at what else is going on in our picture. If you're doing light to moderate exercise, we can use the mitochondria and do aerobic respiration. So you can see the pathway here where we've got the 4 steps of aerobic respiration. So you've got glycolysis, and then you'd form acetyl-CoA, and then the Krebs cycle, and then oxidative phosphorylation. And aerobic respiration, remember, you form the most ATP per glucose that way. So light and moderate exercise you can do for long periods of time. So you can walk, for hours, you can jog for hours, so you can do those activities for a long time. And then the third way to make ATP would be to do fermentation. And remember, when you do fermentation, you're just basically doing glycolysis. So you would split the glucose in half into the pyruvate, and then you end up taking the pyruvate and making it into lactic acid. And you only end up making 2 ATP that way, and so you can't do fermentation, doing that for intense exercise, because you just don't make very much ATP, and so you can't do weightlifting or sprinting for very long periods of time. All right, so let's take a look at using the mitochondria doing aerobic respiration. So if you're doing light to moderate exercise, so light exercise would be maybe like walking, and then moderate exercise would be, for example, maybe going for a jog. And you're able to get enough blood to the muscle, enough oxygen there, and so you can use your mitochondria with the electron transport chain, and you can make lots of ATP this way. And as far as energy sources or nutrient sources to make the ATP, you're actually going to start with using your glycogen stores first. And remember, we do store glycogen in the skeletal muscles. And so when you first start walking or jogging, you haven't increased your blood supply to the muscles enough yet to start bringing in enough glucose and fatty acids. So we're going to use your glycogen stores first. So you just break down the glycogen, break the glucoses off, feed that over to the aerobic respiration pathway, and start making ATP from them. But then after a couple minutes, blood supply increases to the muscles, and then you'll switch over and start using the glucose and fatty acids from the blood, and then you can break those down and make ATP from those. And if you're still doing your light to moderate exercise after half an hour, you're going to stop using glucose from the blood, and you're just going to be using fatty acids from the blood to make the ATP. So why do you think you did that? So why did we decide after half an hour that, hey, skeletal muscle, stop using the glucose. We're just going to use the fatty acids from now on. Leave the glucose alone. So remember, we have to spare the glucose for the central nervous system, for the brain especially, and because the brain, remember, its favorite food is glucose. It really can't use much else to make ATP. I mean, it can use some ketones, but that's about it. So we want to make sure we don't run out of glucose for the brain, and so if we're continuing to exercise after half an hour, we're just going to use fatty acids to make ATP to supply, our contractions for this light to moderate exercise. Okay, fermentation. We're going to use this if we're doing intense exercise. So maybe you're lifting weights or sprinting and you're not able to get enough blood and oxygen to the muscles, so you can't use your mitochondria. They're shut down. So the only way you can make ATP is to use fermentation. And so in fermentation, you're basically just doing glycolysis. So you can only make 2 ATP per glucose. So that's not very much. And then also, you're not able to get enough blood to the muscles, so you really can't get the glucose and fatty acids there. So you're just using your glycogen stores that are stored in the skeletal muscle cells. And so those run out pretty quickly as well, because you're using that to make your ATP. And then also lactic acid is going to start building up, because that's what you're going to be making with fermentation. And that's going to make the inside of the skeletal muscle cells more acidic, and that will actually affect how well the myosin heads will work and do their cross bridge cycling. So you're not going to be able to contract as strongly. So you're not going to be able to sustain high intensity exercise for very long periods of time. And we all know that you can't lift weights or sprint for very long periods. Okay, so these graphs are really nice. What they're just showing you is that in light exercise here, so on the left, if we look at that first, we've got when we first start exercising in red here, notice our first source of ATP is going to be creatine phosphate. So that'll supply the ATP for about the first 15 seconds or so of contraction. And we just need a little bit of time as we start getting fermentation and mitochondria up and working better. And we'll have a little bit of fermentation going on as the mitochondria get going and aerobic respiration gets going. And then the mitochondria will really take over, and then fermentation will drop off, and our blood supply has really increased as well. And so, with this light to moderate intensity exercise, we'll just have aerobic respiration, our mitochondria supplying our ATP, and so we can do that for long periods of time. And then if we're doing intense exercise like weightlifting or sprinting over here on the right, when you start doing those exercises, notice that again, our first source of ATP is going to be creatine phosphate, and that'll supply ATP for about 15 seconds. And that'll just give us some time to ramp up fermentation. And because we're not able to get enough oxygen and blood to the muscles, we're going to be making our ATP by fermentation. And so really very little ATP would be made by the mitochondria. So most of the ATP is going to be made by fermentation. But again, you can't sustain weightlifting and sprinting for very long periods of time. So you can see that things are really going to drop off here, and you just are not going to be able to do those activities for very long. Okay, so you just are not producing a lot of ATP per glucose. You're going to be running out of glycogen. You're building up lactic acid, and yeah, you just can't do those activities very long.